This is episode 1 of the Untwisting the Truth podcast. It is the 21st of March 2021 and 1 year since Boris Johnson put the UK into lockdown, and 1 year of the UK and most of the rest of the world living under the COVID regime. And in this podcast, I am going to give you my thoughts and feelings about this past year. A lot of it retrospectively, what I'm thinking now about the early part of this lockdown. Sometimes you can think a little bit more clearly when you think retrospectively. I'm going to tell you why I've always been opposed to this lockdown, and basically what I hope, my hopes for the future. Now, by way of a bit of background, I have been involved in politics since about 20 years ago. And through my involvement in politics, I did find out about the New World Order agenda, the globalist agenda, groups such as the Bilderberg Group and Trilateral Commission, and things such as Agenda 21. I learned that the whole climate change issue was a complete hoax as well. And I realised that the people who were talking about this were not tinfoil hat lunatics, but these were people who had actually done their research. They dug out documents that are available for anyone to see in the public domain, but they're never reported on by the likes of the BBC. And I couldn't deny the evidence out there for this globalist agenda. Now, for many years, I wasn't sure how prominent it was, whether all the politicians were buying into it. I still clung on to the idea that there's probably some politicians who are good guys out there. I didn't know how much influence the Bilderbergers had and all that. And but by 2019, and I feel that 2019 was a year when we were being primed to all this, because during that year, the climate change hoax really got amped up. Theresa May committed the UK to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I found that absolutely shocking, how we could possibly conceive of being net zero, given that all of us breathe out carbon dioxide every day. And in addition to that, things such as, well, how would we possibly be able to function if we're relying on wind and renewable sources of energy and not driving petrol diesel cars? I mean, it was just absolutely hideous. And then climate change became the climate emergency. We saw the rise of Extinction Rebellion that was saying 2050 is not fast enough, you've got to go net zero by 2025. And of course, Greta Thunberg, who was getting invited to have meetings with politicians such as Michael Gove, even when other more qualified scientists would not get those opportunities, and invited to speak at the UN. And what appalls me and concerns me most of all is that no one was opposing this agenda. No one. I remember watching Question Time back during the week when we had those first lot of climate strikes in September 2019. And the only debate was about whether these strikes were effective, whether Greta Thunberg's strategies are effective, whether Extinction Rebellion's antics are good or not. But no one was fundamentally opposing the narrative. There was no one speaking out on mainstream media saying this whole climate change issue is a complete and utter hoax. The only individual that I could see who was really opposing this properly was Piers Corbyn, but he would never get any airtime on the BBC. So I could see that something really quite nasty was coming down the line. And I thought as we entered into 2020, this would be the battle. The battle would be through the climate change hoax, Agenda 21 being really ramped up, and the battle would be for us having to banning of petrol and diesel cars, we'd be fighting all that kind of stuff. That's what Boris announced on the beginning of February 2020, that stood on the fact with David Attenborough saying we're going to ban petrol and diesel cars by 2032. And I thought this was the real battle. But what I did not see, and I could never see, was the way that when it came to COVID, how social interactions were made illegal. I could see for many years, I could foresee bans on political protests, bans on free speech. I could see an attack on the motorist. I could see all these green initiatives taking off. But one thing I could never envisage was the politicians having an issue with you seeing your family or seeing your friends or having normal social interactions. And this is what has really shocked me about COVID, because I could never see any kind of a precursor to this. Now, in relation to COVID, I remember back in January, February time, there was this virus going about in China and all that sort of thing. And there was this issue about, international travel and whether it would spread to the UK and all that. And I honestly thought it would just be something like swine flu or SARS, something that never really affects people like myself. It's just an issue for the elderly and it would all blow over. But then I found out about the fact that Italy was in lockdown. First of all, one small part of Italy and then the whole country. And I remember reading articles in the Spiked magazine, which I discovered the previous year, that had been quite good at opposing the green agenda. And Spiked, I remember one of their articles, they were saying how, I think it was in Italy, how it was illegal now to have a chat to your neighbours. And how in, I think, France, you were having to have paperwork with you to go outside. And I was absolutely shocked and horrified that this kind of thing was happening in Western democracies. And I was shocked and horrified that no one seemed to be opposing it. Surely with that level of tyranny, there should be an immediate uprising from the masses, a complete outcry, complete pushback. But there didn't seem to be any of that. And it occurred to me during those early weeks of lockdown that we are under attack. Our economy is going to be completely crushed by this, by the government having to pay furlough to everyone for all these businesses closing. And we were under attack. This was a psychological war, all done in the name of a virus. And it was just staggering how we were being told that we need to basically trust the government to give us our freedoms back. It occurred to me that the only way we're really going to get our freedoms back and we're going to get our economy back and we're not going to be turning into some sort of third world dystopia is if we literally have mass civil disobedience. If business owners open up their business, don't wait for the government to give you the go ahead. And all through this time, I was just so disheartened by the fact there was no pushback, that people seemed perfectly happy with it. People wanted to be locked down harder. And the way that all the institutions went along with it, without question, all the supermarkets suddenly imposed all these social distancing rules, expected everyone to wait in 2 meter in queues, 2 meters apart from each other, just to get into a shop to buy a pint of milk. That it was that deadly, that young, healthy people who we know aren't at risk were having to live like this just because there's a possibility that they might pass it on to someone who happens to be more vulnerable or elderly and dies of it, even though there is no way to prove it. And this is what has got to me continuously, the lack of proof. He who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. And yet Boris Johnson did nothing to prove his proposition. When he said this is the biggest crisis since the Second World War, on his when he announced the lockdown, where's his proof of that? All we were expected just to go by these pictures of hospitals busy hospitals and crying nursing, and that to be our proof. Well, that's not good enough. But that what really got to me is the fact the public accepted this without any proof of claim. And I just thought this argument that Boris was making, that we have to do this, it's not necessarily to stop this disease or stop people catching it. It's just to slow the spread so the NHS doesn't get overwhelmed at one time. And so we can just spread out over a long period. I mean, we've never used this argument before. This has never happened before. It just seems such an absurd proposition. And the idea that we have this virus that is invisible, but it's really, really deadly. And even if you're healthy, you still might be contagious. So all of a sudden, literally overnight, healthy people are now treated as sick, that there's some sort of biohazard. And I just found this completely absurd and insidious. And I was just shocked by the way the masses were buying into it. Does this not sound ridiculous? Are you not going to think about this? Think this through? I was staying with some relatives at this time. I normally, and I do live on my own, but when this all began, I was really quite frightened. I didn't know what was going to be happening, and I didn't want to be on my own, so I stayed with a few relatives. And I was really disheartened, no disrespect, but these relatives, they just bought into the narrative. They weren't like, cowering in fear over the virus, but they generally bought into the narrative that, large gatherings are irresponsible and that there is some deadly virus out there. I mean, it's like a sci-fi movie, and this is another thing that got to me. I mean, I perhaps thought in the back of my mind that, however the New World Order ushers in its final moves, I thought at that time people would suddenly cotton on to what's going on. They'd suddenly remember, the people the tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists who'd warned about this, and they'd suddenly realize, aha, they must be right. I thought what people would cotton on to it and woken up. And I thought that during those early weeks of lockdown, especially as people were on furlough, large numbers of people had loads of time on their hands. I thought people would be digging and researching what is going on to find out what's really going on, and have a bit of suspicion. And I'm sure some people did, but I didn't see any evidence that happened on any great scale. And because you see, for me, my life was destroyed, my personal life. I had a job that I enjoyed, that was working well for me. I was placed on furlough, but I had other activities that I like to do. I mean, I'm a single guy. I had activities down the pub during the week and at the weekends that I really enjoyed, that made my life living worthwhile. I've been a musician in recent years. I've played guitar at gigs in local pubs. All that was taken away from me in an instant, and I had nothing left. I felt I had nothing to live for, because given the fact that I couldn't see any scientific justification for why we had this lockdown, I had no assurance that this would ever be over. And despite the masses saying, oh, this will all be over, and the media saying, we'll just keep the rules and we'll get our summer back, they can't prove that. But I saw all these other articles of people who've done their research saying, no, this is not the case. I remember seeing an article in the Technology Review, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the headline was, we're never going back to normal. It suggested that when we do eventually open up, we'll have to have health passports, and we'll have to constantly justify our health status and be everything controlled by the state. And I was horrified. I thought, I've got nothing to live for. I've got nothing to look forward to. It felt like a death sentence. And I want to know what's going on. When something affects my life to such an extent, I'm not content just to wait and see and just wait for the government to give my freedoms back to me. I want to know what's going on, and I want to find a way out of it. And what I was doing is I was trying to connect, particularly during that first month when I felt distraught. It was one of the worst months of my life. I was trying to connect with like-minded people who would be happy to meet up in parks and maybe in houses and that. People who didn't want to follow all the rules and go along with this agenda, and people who knew there was something. And I really was, I was scared for the future. I feel a lot more relaxed now because I have met so many people, and I don't feel alone. And I know we're gonna, like, whatever happens, we can get through it together. But at the time, I just felt like it was just terrifying. It was really, really daunting. And yeah, another thing that has occurred to me throughout this whole thing is, as I think I mentioned before, the lack of proof of claim. I mean, what really got to me was I would comment on various social media platforms my feelings about this, particularly on the local news and community forums, and I would be attacked continuously by a whole lot of people. They calling me dangerous, saying that I'm mentally ill just because I wasn't believing the government narrative, just because I was trying to share alternative information, and I was just horrified and appalled. And I mean, that still happens now, but I mean, the comments are more balanced. I do get a lot more support from people. But everyone was believing we need to stay at home now. We've got to suck it up, follow the rules, because then we'll get a good summer. It was springtime. We want to have our summer back. But the thing is, the government and the BBC were giving this impression that if you just follow the rules, we'll get this over with. But, and this has applied throughout the whole year. They have never given us any tangible, measurable, or verifiable evidence to prove that. It's all been vague, nothing specific. And when you're vague, you can make any promise you like and not keep them, not hold to your promises, and not take the blame for it because you were never clear what your promises were in the first place. And this is what's got to me. People just believe because the government, the BBC suggested so, that we just follow all the rules now and we'll have a good summer, you'll get your lives back. When has that happened in history? And what's the criteria? What are the specifics? As I've said in some of my YouTube videos, if the government wanted to be honest and wanted to be upfront with the people and genuinely cared, they would be specific. They would show specifically in their briefings the scientific justification for this lockdown and show us every single day how our progress towards it, and give us hope. And so we could see when the science allowed us to open up in different ways, rather than just being told, oh, the science says this, the science says that, without us, the public, having any way of us being able to verify that science for ourselves. And this has been a frustration throughout the whole thing. And okay, the first month of lockdown was awful for me. It got better after about sort of like mid to late April, because they started to connect with quite a few like-minded people, and we did find some ways of meeting up and supporting each other. And people who were awake, people who knew this was a scam, this wasn't about a virus, this was a globalist agenda, were desperate for connection, for company. And many awake people would say that they've met more friends throughout this year than in any previous year. And that has been a good positive side effect of the scamdemic. But obviously things opened up a little bit in May time. It went away from stay at home to stay alert. You could start to meet with a few more people. But then, of course, in June time, they started mandating masks, face masks, for public transport. And I was livid at first that they would do this. Because, I mean, again, why should we be told what to wear? I mean, a face mask is not good for your health. It's just common sense that it's going to reduce your oxygen intake. I don't need no scientist with a PhD telling me it's all okay. It doesn't do that. It doesn't limit your oxygen intake. A child can figure that one out. If you put earmuffs on your ears, your hearing's infected. Put misty goggles on your eyes, your eyesight's going to be hindered. You cover your nose and mouth, you can't breathe properly. It's that simple. But what was absurd, I mean, I really hoped that the masking thing would just wake a few more people up. Now, why are we doing this 4 months into a pandemic? And then a month later, they said, now it's masks in shops as well. So this masking is gradually coming in during the course of the summer, whilst the restrictions on gatherings have been eased a bit and there's some semblance of normality. And I really hope that that wakes people up, thinking that people would think, hang on a minute, you know, why, if masks worked, why didn't we mandate them at the beginning of the pandemic? Why now? And it's been just very disheartening that once again the public have been okay, they acquiesced to it all, and because I think what has to happen is everyone has a tipping point, everyone has a level of control, or that's just not acceptable to them, and people generally take the path of least resistance until they reach that tipping point, that breaking point, and then they will push back. But I've been disheartened that the pushback couldn't come sooner. That people, I mean, what really should have happened, I think, and I would really have liked to have seen, is pushback from day one, when all these businesses were told that you've got to close your doors, there's a deadly virus out there. The business owners should be saying, hang on a minute, what's going on here? I need some proof. I don't mind closing my business down if you can prove that we are genuine public health threat, but I need that proof first. And we should have had loads of business owners writing in notice of conditional acceptances to the government, notice of liability, saying that, telling them for proof of claim and all that sort of thing. But we didn't get that. And it, again, I mean, it's just that, again, so disheartening. And the other thing, just retrospectively, that I have found so absurd was the fact that we did all this lockdown not based upon anything that actually happened, but based upon a forecast. I mean, that even more mad that is. I mean, taking extreme measure, an unprecedented measure, declaring an emergency, locking the country down based on what you think is going to happen, when you know full well, it's common sense, lockdown is going to do immense damage to the economy, to people's physical and mental health and well-being. They cancelled all these people's cancer treatments, other medical treatments, dental treatment. I mean, that was one of the most frightening things of all, the fact that your dentist was closed except for emergency, and you expected to do DIY dentistry. Well, who can do that? Absolutely shocking, and all based on a forecast. I mean, let's imagine, for instance, that you're a restaurant owner and one day your restaurant gets a bit busier than usual. You've got more customers coming in, there's more cooking going on, and you have to cook meals more quickly, cook them faster and faster and faster. And you say, oh, I think we're going to have a fire now because there's so much cooking going on. So you shut the restaurant down before anything's happened based on the forecast or prediction of a fire. That'd be absolute madness. You would never do that. And the idea of declaring an emergency not based on something that has actually happened, but based on a forecast, was most absurd. And especially when on the day, I think it was the 25th of March 2020, when the Coronavirus Act was passed through Parliament, Neil Ferguson, whose forecast this all stemmed from, of 500,000 deaths, he recanted on that and said 20,000 deaths. And what should have happened then is Boris Johnson should have gone on the TV and said, look guys, you know, we've really made a big mistake here. We did this lockdown on a forecast. We now know that forecast being recanted. We're opening up again. That's what should have happened. And again, the very fact that didn't happen, it confirmed more and more that there was no scientific justification for this, and therefore we cannot simply trust the government to give our freedoms back, because how are they going to find the scientific justification to do that if there was no scientific justification to lock us down in the first place? And they can just manipulate it to suit whatever agendas they want. So this has been my whole feelings throughout the scamdemic. I've been to quite a few protests. I've tried to look for indications that people were waking up, doing their research. I know there are some that have, inevitably, and other people who maybe knew a bit about these sort of things who kind of reawoken about this. I know it, obviously, that's happened to some extent. And I know that people, almost everyone thinks the government's in a mess. They don't understand what they're doing, the way they're going from lockdowns to tier restrictions to, we had a tier restrictions in October, then lockdown in November, then back to tiers in December. I know this doesn't make a lot of sense to people. And the one good thing is that, out and about, I think all of us recognise it. People are behaving far more normally. I mean, it was really dystopian during the first lockdown. It was just like a massive open prison. These days, I'm seeing people mingling in parks, children playing on the swings and slides, and people not trying to keep a distance from each other all the time. And I think people have either got fed up with it, or they just realise that there isn't this deadly virus out there. I mean, of course, you're going to get some who are still in fear of the virus, still scared to leave the house. But I think the majority of people have a bit more common sense than they did a year ago, and they're out of the shock of this. So that is hopeful, because I'm seeing people behaving more normally. And I was very encouraged by the protests that took place yesterday on World Freedom Day, and an estimated somewhere around 100,000 people in London, possibly more. And not only that, but there were other protests in other parts of the country. And of course, a lot of people in the freedom movement didn't go to any protests because they thought the whole thing might have been a trap set up by the police. So of course I am, and I was really pleased to see the coverage of that, and I hope that this protest is going to signal a shift. It's going to be the start of the people getting the upper hand in this fight we're in, because it really has been a battle, and I know that the people controlling this are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the world's population. But too many people have been forced to go along with this agenda because of the issue of money. I mean, I can't help comparing this to the war of Iraq in 2003 and weapons of mass destruction, because we know now that Tony Blair took us into an illegal war. But comparing this to that, back during the war, prior to the war, during the one after, there were loads of people opposing it. The Lib Dems opposed it. The trade union movement all opposed it. There was no virtue signalling linked to it. There was no shaming of people opposing the war. People knew that the government was lying about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So why is it that this time around people are believing this government's claim? Why do they not believe weapons of mass destruction, but they believe in this stuff about a virus? And it gets to me, the fact that all the institutions, such as the major charities, the human rights groups, the trade unions, and of course the police force, and all the other big institutions have just gone along with this, in many cases, enforcing social distancing or masks rules over and above what the government have told them to do. That's really got to me. The fact that the way institutions have just gone along with this without question. And I personally feel let down. I have a mild disability. I'm on the autistic spectrum myself. And I feel let down by the disability charities that, because of government funding, government grants, that sort of thing, they did not speak out against the agenda. They have failed to oppose the COVID regime, and they've failed the people they're supposed to represent who suffered as a result of the COVID regime. So this is basically a summary of my feelings throughout this last year. There's probably many more things I could add to this, but what I've said is basically a summary of how I felt during this year. But I mean, about the future, I don't know, but I personally feel a lot less anxious than I did this time a year ago, because of the fact that I know so many awake people now, and I'm coming across more and more of them, as over the weeks and months, and I was encouraged by the numbers at the protest. I'm not always convinced that whether protests making a difference themselves, but I'm hoping that the protest that we saw yesterday was symbolic of the fact that we've had a year of this, and in this forthcoming year, we're gonna see more pushback. We're going to see the people start to win this war. We're going to start to see more victories for freedom and for truth, because that's what matters. I want truth to win, and I know that we are being governed on the basis of lies. I wouldn't mind so much living in an authoritarian regime if that regime was genuinely based on truth. And what matters to me is that people learn the truth about this scandemic, the truth about the New World Order. I think a lot of people out there are in a state of cognitive dissonance. They know that something's wrong. They've probably heard somebody talk about the New World Order, the globalist plans, someone in their circle over the last 10, 20 years, and they perhaps know deep down that they're right, but they just cannot bring themselves to acknowledge it because it's too scary. I think there's a lot of that going on. But to end this podcast, I am hopeful that people are going to act more normally, that whatever the government does, they're going to push back. There's going to be more pushback in some form. And ultimately, it's a tiny minority of the world's population controlling this scandemic. We've got over 99% of people are on our side. The problem is those people who are working for various institutions are having to perpetuate the COVID regime in some way. So we really need civil disobedience in the workplace as well. But that's a summary of my thoughts and feelings I've had over the past year. It's been a year like no other. In 1 year, for me, it's been the worst year ever. In another year, in another way, it's been the best year in a strange way. But that's all I'm going to say for now. I hope to do more podcasts. I hope to explore all these issues and more in more depth in future episodes. I have hopes to develop this. I hope you join me on the journey, because what I want to do is I want to untwist the truth. I've thought about this name for some time, untwisting the truth, and that's exactly what I want to do. We live in a twisted world. We are given a twisted version of reality. Everything is twisted, and we need to untwist the truth and not be governed by twisted thinking, but be governed according to straight thinking. Bring back logic, reason, and common sense and rationality. Thank you very much for listening. I will speak again soon. Bye for now.